This is a severe weather alert from WWL Weather, sponsored by Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this 3 o'clock update on Tropical Storm Arthur. I'm Katie Moore. We have some new information from New Orleans officials as they're preparing for the heavy rain that Arthur is expected to bring. However, we want the forecast that we can expect. Chris?
Yeah, we're still looking at really nothing has changed with regard to the naming now of Arthur. And kind of going back in time, 1 a.m. advisory early this morning from the Hurricane Center, they actually decreased the chance of this becoming a named storm and kind of maintained that thinking through the early morning hours. And then after about 9, they said, well, the circulation at the center looks like it's pretty closed off. And there were supports from a ship and the hurricane hunters of winds of 40 miles an hour, which would then make this a tropical storm. However, something that is abundantly clear is that where you found those strongest winds at almost 150 miles away from the center is nowhere close to where that closed circulation is. So this remains and will continue to be a very lopsided storm where the center of the storm will make landfall, or quote unquote landfall. It's actually right along the coastline at the moment. So there may never really be another landfall unless it gets out into the Gulf waters. That is kind of meaningless to us because we're watching this abundant moisture that will start moving our way. Already getting some of the rainfall along the coastline, some of that's starting to move inland. This isn't really the heaviest of what we're expecting. That arrives later tonight. And a lot of the model guidance is indicating it may be following a trajectory taking it from parts of the western bayou parishes, river parishes, more toward the Atchafalaya even, and then on to the North Shore with the city of New Orleans not getting nearly that much rain. Now going into the overnight, this will be a problem for our North Shore parishes, Mississippi counties, as well as the rivers north of the lake. That is going to be the greatest concern with regard to flash flooding. It looks like that may be shifting a little bit away from the metro area and more so onto the North Shore. You can join us on WWL streaming app for more detailed information on this. Plus, we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A with Katie Moore coming up right now, but we'll return to your regularly scheduled programming.
This has been a severe weather alert from WWL Weather, sponsored by Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services.
All right, thank you for joining us on streaming. We're going to update what have a little bit more detailed look at the forecast and why it does look like the trend has been a bit drier. Not that we can breathe that sigh of relief, far from it. Still some areas expecting heavy rain. It just may not be all of southeast Louisiana. We're starting to, as I'd mentioned on our new on air WWL, we're starting to get some of those showers somewhat associated with Arthur moving along the coastline, but the bulk of the moisture still remains offshore. And again, far removed from the center of circulation, which is basically right on the coast of coastal Texas. This starts moving in later on tonight. And note what our model here is indicating. It stays more toward the Atchafalaya Basin and then continues up to the North Shore. Here we are at 1 a.m. Do you see any rain around the city? Not much. The bulk of the rain continues onto the North Shore, going now closer to daybreak and even after sunrise. That continues into the late morning hours, and then by the afternoon, evening tomorrow, we finally start to see most of our rainfall coming to an end. Now, this is the Euro, which is not a high-resolution model, so it doesn't show the fine detail of where some of the storms are. So it really shows more or less the bulk of moisture moving over southeast Louisiana. But note, it does indicate a little bit more of the intense rains or the heavier rainfall accumulation totals around the Atchafalaya Basin and then continuing across parts of the North Shore. So again, it may be that we don't see as much rain over the city compared to what we could see on the North Shore, and in particular as that storm continues into Mississippi and then eventually toward Alabama. So this is what the Euro is calling for, and I'm kind of overestimating even what the model is saying. 1 to 3 inches of rainfall south of the lake, kind of a corridor of 3 to 4 plus inches, 3 to 6 inches of rainfall north of the lake, as well as into Mississippi, some pockets of 6+ inches. This is a product from the National Weather Service, and they're calling for 1/2 inch to 1 inch around the city. a corridor of 2 to 3 plus inches of rainfall, again, from the Atchafalaya onto the North Shore, 3 to 4, maybe areas of 5 plus. Localized totals of 8 or more inches of rainfall still very possible. And in particular, modeling continues to indicate it's going to be more of a focus on the North Shore, and that may be where we get the bulk of the rainfall accumulation. That puts more of a threat for river flooding on the North Shore. And we've already seen the rivers overflowing their banks on the North Shore because of the heavy rains that we saw going back to yesterday. Greater threat for flooding will be ongoing overnight tonight and into early tomorrow morning. After 6 a.m. tomorrow, the flooding threat really starts to shift more to the east and continues shifting to the east as we head into Friday. So the greater threat of any flooding really occurs overnight tonight and wrapping just around daybreak tomorrow morning. Again, most of our rivers on the North Shore, they're all under flood warnings, but some of them are expected to reach moderate or major flood category due to the expected rains that we will get during the overnight hours tonight and into early on Thursday. Good news is we do start drying out during the day Thursday. Not completely dry, but certainly much less rain on Thursday and Friday. And then this coming weekend, much drier, and that will continue onto the coming week. So right now what we're thinking is that the main focus for any impactful weather is going to be the flooding rain threat, especially our North Shore and Mississippi rivers. Rain starts moving in later tonight and throughout the early part of the day tomorrow, starting to taper off by probably tomorrow afternoon, evening. And then secondary to all of that will be some minor coastal flooding. Storm surge along our southern shorelines expected to be at around 1 to 3 feet along with the stronger winds. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now as far as the impactful weather goes with regard to southeast Louisiana. Metro area is certainly looking a little bit better for the heaviest of the rain, not to, again, completely breathe that sigh of relief, but it has certainly been a trend we have seen on the models. Really going back to what it is today. Now, Wednesday, going back to Monday, that has been the trend where we were expecting the bulk of the rain to stay more north of the lake. Now, at that time, it was looking at kind of extreme numbers, and those numbers have come down a bit, but still flash flooding, river flooding, North Shore.
Yes, we did see like 20 plus inches of rain in some of those
numbers,
graphics earlier this week.
Those numbers have significantly backed down, mainly because what storms that we're expecting to move over us overnight tonight are in the Gulf now, so we have an idea of where they're going.
Okay.
We've also started to see a lot more dry air, which helps us out. That helps evaporate a lot of that moisture. It helps reduce those rainfall totals. And as long as these storms move, we shouldn't see those dramatic rainfall total numbers.
When I was looking at those graphics, it reminded me of 2016 when we had those storms in Baton Rouge that caused big problems for Baton Rouge. It looked like the heaviest of the rainfall maybe actually centered in the areas above those rivers. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, and it's going to be kind of that the Florida parishes probably a little bit more at risk from the Atchafalaya, not as much of a concern over the Atchafalaya Basin. The bulk of it occurs over the basin, then no real flooding issues at all.
Yeah.
But if it starts to get into the populated areas, and really probably that corridor from Baton Rouge toward the North Shore, the I-10-12 corridor toward Mississippi, we'll probably see the bulk of our substantial rainfall totals, but even those are much lower than we had been previously forecast.
So our primary concern will be driving around the roads, which hopefully most people aren't doing overnight.
Hopefully not overnight, and again, by after daybreak tomorrow, we should start to see some reduction in the rainfall. Obviously, after the heavy rains, we'll have some flooded streets, low-lying areas, especially north of the lake, but can't say we're not going to see anything in the city. We know it doesn't take much. All we need is one heavy downpour over the city, and all of a sudden we've got some flooding. It looks like probably more of a widespread concern North Shore. Okay, and North Shore, people who really need to be preparing right now are people who have places near those rivers. Yes. Okay, so we're not talking about just average street flooding that we think is going to get into people's houses. That is possible. That is certainly possible. I mean, I can't speak to drainage and you know how quickly water can get off of streets and how fast it is able to rise. What we're looking at is more of a concern would be with the rivers. Kind of secondary to that is still a flash flood risk, which would then be a threat for lower lying homes where water can easily get in. And before we wrap this up, the rivers that we're talking about here, are those the ones up in Tangipahoa Parish? Are we talking about the Pearl River? Are we looking at those areas in Hancock County and Mississippi? I'm going to see if I can go back to that graphic.
with the Pearl that, that area has already got a ton of rain and is already elevated.
We've seen most of our rain totals, if you think back to in May when we were in a drought, and we've seen that rapidly erode, is because of most of the heavy rainfall. And most of that over the last month have been on the North Shore. And so ground there, rivers saturated, rivers are swollen to their banks, and now we're expecting even additional rains through the overnight.
Okay, so this is Mississippi, and then could that affect the Pearl River in those areas in Slidell that tend to flood?
It could. It very easily could, especially if we get some of these heavier downpours that flood or that fall over the Pearl River Basin, then absolutely.
Like Palm Lake, some of those subdivisions,
some
River
of those
Oaks.
areas, it doesn't take much rain to see the flooding, and the water that does fall in the basin has to go somewhere, so it all flows into the Pearl, and then you get those river levels increasing.
And does that, where these storms set up on the top part of those rivers, so to speak, is that what affects whether or not we're going to see this?
Exactly. Okay. The rain falls, in the city, we have to pump it out. On the North Shore, you have a river system, but those rivers do tend to overflow their banks. So I would say most all the rivers, as I'd mentioned, are under a flood warning and could easily overflow their banks at some moderate to major flood stage.
So if you have property or if you're staying in an area that tends to flood around homes and businesses up on the North Shore, those are areas that you really need to pay attention to this weather. Thanks so much, Chris, for joining me for this quick little question and answer session. I know a lot of you out there probably have some questions too.